We are about to take a walk back in time and go over the history of one of the most famous haunted houses in Florida. It has been the subject of many ghost hunting TV shows and well-known YouTube channels. The house now sits in Yesteryear Village, located in the South Florida Fairgrounds. This historical park is a 10-acre living museum full of buildings from the 1850s to the 1950s. In previous videos, we have discussed some of the Riddle house ghost stories. You may have heard about the man who hung himself in the attic. In this episode, we are going to show the facts on the families that actually lived in this two-story wood frame house. On June 13, 1901, Joseph Jefferson will record his plat map for what will become Lakeview Extension of West Palm Beach. Joseph Jefferson was a stage actor, famous for playing Rip Van Winkle, and a very close friend of Henry Flagler. Considered a pioneer in the development and being responsible for our first electrical and ice company, Jefferson spends most of his spare time painting and fishing. You can see some of his paintings today in the gatekeeper's house.
The three paintings and the rug and the two paintings that are similar to these in the dining room are from the estate of Joseph Jefferson.
On March 1st, 1904, Henry Flagler will record the plot map for Woodlawn Cemetery, located at 1301 South Dixie Highway in West Palm Beach. The cemetery would quickly become a preferred spot for burial and a destination spot for locals and tourists. People were known to come just to stroll the oleander-lined streets. Many famous locals and infamous murderers are buried here, and the cemetery has a great history of its own to be told. On April 23, 1905, at the age of 76, Joseph Jefferson will succumb to a case of pneumonia at his cottage located at the Breakers in Palm Beach. After Jefferson's death, his estate sells the Lakeview Extension to Curry Investment and Title Guarantee Company, and it is renamed Jefferson Park. Although Jefferson is not buried at Woodlawn, many of the rich Palm Beachers were being interred here wearing some of their favorite jewelry. Because of this, grave robbers quickly became an issue. In response to this, Flagler will acquire lots 9 and 10, Block 5 of Jefferson Park, and the gatekeeper's cottage will be built across the street from Woodlawn's entrance. So here on the corner of what was then known as Poinsettia, now known as South Dixie, and the cross street originally known as Guava Street, then Flagler Avenue, and finally Acacia Street, was where the gatekeeper's cottage was built. Now there would be a full-time caretaker and security on the scene to protect the grave sites.
The house is said to have been built with materials donated from Henry Morrison Flagler.
During this time in history, the Breakers Hotel had just had its second major fire, so leftover wood would have been plentiful. The house, now carrying the address of 327, would also be used for an office and funeral parlor. On July 1st, 1905, construction starts. In April of 1906, we see a deed announcement in the paper where Flagler transfers from his model land company the 17 acres for the cemetery and the gatekeeper's cottage to Woodlawn Cemetery Corporation. Carl Freed will live here from 1906 to 1914. He was an accomplished boater, florist, and landscape architect for Flagler. He was given the job as the first overseer of Woodlawn Cemetery. Carl and his wife Louise and their 5 children, Teresa 16, Carl Jr. 15, Albert 14, Laura 6, and Dorothea 3, move into the new gatekeeper's cottage in 1906. We can confirm this from the 1910 census and see his occupation is listed as gardener and landscaper.
So 9 people in the house while this room was being used for funerals. So I feel for the poor kids who had to stay in their rooms during funerals.
In September of 1914, Carl will then move a few blocks down and open a local grocery. He was reported in the Palm Beach Post as saying, "The worst part about having the store so near the cemetery is that the spooks come over and call on him for their midnight lunch." Other than Carl being present at a murder at Zapp's Bar reported on December 24, 1907 in the Miami Metropolis, I found no other evidence of anything other than fun parties and social events listed in the Tropical Sun newspaper. Their son is married at their new home on 909 South Poinsettia Street on November 19, 1914. Carl and his wife pass in 1937 and 1938. Both are buried in the Woodlawn Cemetery. All of their kids lived to the 1960s and 70s, and all grandchildren were born after they moved out of 327. Henry Flagler will die in 1913, and in 1914 the city of West Palm Beach will acquire Woodlawn Cemetery from the corporation that Flagler had set up to run it. It will state in the deed that the property of the gatekeeper's cottage will only ever be occupied by the overseer of the cemetery rent-free. So any city official that lives in the house from here forward will also be in charge of the cemetery. James Asher lives here from 1915 to 1919. In 1914, James becomes the superintendent of streets, and overseeing the cemetery now is his responsibility. James, his wife Eva, and their only daughter, Mary Virginia, 12 years of age, will now come to live at the city house for the next 5 years. We see they are living here by January of 1915 because there was a wedding announcement for some friends that they let use the house for the ceremony, as stated in the Tropical Sun. In November of 1916, you will see the house being used as a gallery and art lessons by Frances Bell Souse while the family is still living there. Being very civil-minded and always involved in city issues, it was not surprising to read that on January 24, 1917, the Palm Beach Post reports that James Asher chased down a group of society ladies that stole some hibiscus flowers from the cemetery hedges for their society event centerpieces. In 1919, politics and the way the city is run will begin to change. A city manager will be hired, and much of what James does will be reassigned. Seeing the writing on the wall, James resigns on October 31st, 1919, at the age of 51. His daughter Virginia will marry in 1927 and move out of the state. In 1932, at 29 years of age, she will become pregnant with her first child and unfortunately dies during a 14-hour delivery and returns with her unborn child to be buried at Woodlawn Cemetery. James will pass in 1940 and his wife in 1954, also both buried in Woodlawn. Joseph Firth will live in the house in 1920. It was announced 5 days after Asher resigns that the first city manager is hired. He is to get $4,500 for the year minus $500 for rent. Not sure why this is, because Flagler's deed specifically says no rent to be charged. The Palm Beach Post reports on December 9, 1919, that the first city manager of the new commission will occupy the house on Flagler and Dixie. In the 1920 census taken the first week of January, you can see Joseph, his wife Maud, their 11-year-old son James, and 9-year-old daughter Marjorie are living in the house. As one of the first city managers in Florida, all eyes are on West Palm Beach and how the new form of government is going to work out. Fort Lauderdale had tried this and failed only after a month. Unfortunately, Firth will resign in July of 1920, just 6 months after taking the position. His reason is that his wife was very ill and he was needed at home. So he buys a car and tours the country. He will run again in April of 1923, but does not get elected. He and his family will move back to Pennsylvania, where they will spend the rest of their lives. Carl Riddle moves into the house from 1920 to 1923. Many local residents thought the next city manager should be a local, but the commissioners elected once again to hire from outside the state. Carl Riddle from Kansas was hired, and after some renovations were made to the gatekeeper's cottage, Carl, his wife Louise, and their 2 daughters, Harriet, 2 years old, and Marvarette, barely a year old, move in late 1920. With Louise having 2 kids under 3, she had her hands full, and they advertised for help. Carl worked hard on trying to clean up and beautify the city, starting with eradicating the roaches. A lot of the construction and purchases were made in trying to update the city and its infrastructure. So while many liked the changes going on, there were those that would say too much money was spent and did not like the higher taxes. Carl Riddle served under political controversy and had an ongoing feud with a local judge, Joe Ehrman. All of this finally led to Carl being recalled on April 4th, 1923. The Riddles move out of the house on April 26th, 1923, according to the Palm Beach Post.
Now, this is the only really original, and by original I mean from 1920 to 1923 when Carl Riddle lived here. This is the only original piece of furniture in the house, and it was built out of a Riddle family baby crib.
Carl will continue to work with his twin brother at their engineering firm and will go on to be responsible for much of the development of Palm Beach County. The Riddles will find their resting place in Hillcrest Memorial when the time comes. Carl lives to be 95 and his wife Louise 77. Their daughter Harriet lives until 2011 and Marvarette dies in 2017. Colonel Eliza Bard will live in the house from 1924 to 1925. He is considered a pioneer of the Lake Worth area and moves into the gatekeeper's cottage, or also known as the city house, with his wife Ethelyn. Already an engineer and former city director and county surveyor, the colonel goes to work for West Palm Beach as a city engineer, according to the Palm Beach Post on June 9, 1923. George Wright, who became the city manager after Carl Riddle, is offered the house to live in but declines, leaving it available for the new city engineer and sometimes acting city manager. He and his wife, a known accomplished pianist, were popular for their musical gatherings. If there was a musical performance anywhere in the area, you can expect Ethelyn to be behind the piano. We see Bard here in the city directory for 1924. Bard will be sitting in on the meeting where El Cid is created. He will be the engineer in charge when the widening of South Dixie is started. But soon after, in the beginning of 1925, there are rumors that the new city manager, Wright, will resign, and when that happens, a few weeks later, Bard will also step down and go back to his civil engineering work. After leaving the cemetery house, their daughter Audrey is born in 1928. On July 15, 1930, while in Kentucky working, the colonel will die unexpectedly, leaving his wife to raise their 1-year-old daughter. He is buried there in Kentucky. Later, his wife, Ethelyn, and her daughter and Ethelyn's mother will return to West Palm Beach. Ethelyn will pass in 1960 and is buried in Miami, Florida. Frank Mathis will live in the house from 1925 to 1927. Frank Mathis, also known as Alligator Frank, will be the next to move into the house. A taxidermist known for being able to wrangle an alligator just by talking to him is also the superintendent of city parks. Frank is a well-known local and will be in the gatekeeper's cottage longer than anyone else. Here we have a letter dated in July of 1925 from the city stating he will use the house as soon as it is vacant and also to be available to run a cemetery office out of there for visitors. In September of 1925, the Palm Beach Post reports he finds what he thinks is a dead man in the cemetery. The man was actually just sleeping. But it leads you to believe he was probably living in the house by then. He will be there when the new gates are installed after South Dixie is widened. In 1926, according to the city directory, Francis and Edward McCormick are listed as living at 327 Acacia. Francis is a civil engineer and Edward is listed as a carpenter. Edward at the time was married to Mabel. In further research, it does not appear they are brothers. In the middle of 1927, a city clerk and city manager and several others, not including Frank, are accused of fraud, and any of those that were involved in the chain of money will be put on suspension from his current position. This would include Frank, so he and his wife Mary and 3 kids, Robert 8, Geraldine 2, and Doris a newborn, will move out for a time being. Walter Goodale will reside in the house from 1927 to 1928. In July of 1927, Walter D. Goodale will now be in charge of parks. He, his wife Alice, daughter Ola, 20 years old, and son Walter Jr., 17, will move into 327 Acacia. They are all listed in the 1927 city directory living at the cemetery house. In April of 1928, Walter finds a lost police dog and puts a notice in the paper listing the 327 Acacia address. Also in 1928, an Archie Sibley, who is an inspector, is noted as living in the house. In 1929, the city directory shows Goodale and his wife living somewhere else. In 1960, Alice will have a bad fall in Texas, and this leads to her death. Walter will remain a government employee along with his son and pass in 1968. I believe none of them are buried in Woodlawn. James McCurdy will have a short stay in 1930. He is a city street employee and is unmarried and is listed in the newspaper in January and April of 1930 selling ads for the Palm Beach Post, and he uses the address of 327 Acacia. In the 1930 census taken on May 2nd, there is nobody living at 327 Acacia. James will pass in 1938 at the age of 59 while living with his brother-in-law and is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. Frank Mathis will move back into the house from 1931 to 1950. We have here a letter from Frank's oldest daughter that talks about the timeline of the Mathis family and living in the house. In an article dated May 12, 1928, the commission is fighting to get Frank Mathis reinstated as the superintendent of parks. In the 1928 and 1929 city directory, he is listed at his home on 734 North Street, which he owns and rents out while living on Acacia Street. The 1930 census, taken on April 14th, reports him living on 734 North Street with the occupation of superintendent of parks. He is listed in the 1931 city directory as living back at the 327 Acacia address. Also in this directory, there is a maid listed. When he moves back in there will be a newborn boy, Raymond, along with the rest of his family, and Frank Jr. will come along in 1932. Frank Sr.'s name is mentioned in a newspaper article on March 10, 1931, that the roof of 327 catches on fire from sparks coming from the chimney. The same exact thing will happen again on March 19th of 1936.
There was always a lot of music in the house. We know this. We also know, and we're not sure which owners, but probably multiple owners, would have friends over and they would play music, they would dance in the parlor, on the porch, and I'm told that the kids would sit at the top of the stairs just out of sight if you're not really looking hard.
Okay.
And listen to everything that was going on.
In the time the family lives in the cottage, there will be lots of social gatherings, and in 1943 there will be a wedding for Geraldine, who then will move to California. On December 19, 1946, it is reported that a woman was found ransacking the house. In January of 1948, there was a theft at the cemetery, and he is listed as its caretaker. Frank will retire and move to his farm in 1950, as his daughter tells us in the letter. We also see this in the 1950 census, where they are listed living on a farm. It also includes a granddaughter born on August 3, 1946 in California. It appears through research that they raise her as their own, and it is reasonable to guess she may have lived in the gatekeeper's cottage for a short time. Many of Mathis' family are buried in the Woodlawn Cemetery. Otis Jones will take control of the house in 1950 through 1967. He appears to be the last city worker to live in the gatekeeper's cottage. A longtime city employee and superintendent of the garbage trucks, he is listed on the 1950 census taken on April 11th as sexton of the cemetery, and his wife Riley and 18-year-old daughter Janine, along with her 16-year-old brother, are also listed as living in the house. In 1955, Otis is mentioned in a newspaper report of a man who tried to take his own life in the cemetery. Some other articles that mention Otis at the city house address are when he announces that his daughter will be married on October 26, 1951, and in 1957 he announces his son is to marry. In April of 1958, they will announce a granddaughter is born. In an article dated January 20th, 1966, it talks about vandalism at the Woodlawn Cemetery, and he is listed as the caretaker. In February of 1967, he receives an award for safe driving as city employee. At some point, I assume he retires and they move back to Georgia. Otis passes in 1972. His son James and wife Riley are also buried in Georgia. In 1970, the city of West Palm Beach goes to court in efforts to sell the old gatekeeper's cottage. The final judgment is in, and they are able to do so. I found 3 separate ads where the city tried selling the old gatekeeper's cottage, and finally in 1972, a known watercolor artist, Marianne Hayes, wins the bid at $27,000. Her hope was to run an art school out of it. I found some notices where she is selling off old furniture from the address and filing for the fictitious name Flagler Art Center. I found an interesting article where she has to fight to operate out of the house because of code enforcement, and she promises to keep the attic locked and not use it at all. I do not believe anyone lived there, and it was just used as a school and gallery. There will be numerous ads in the Palm Beach Post for classes. Marianne will pass away September 16, 1985, and is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. On January 12, 1979, Christy Davidson, her husband, and her brother Marsh King purchased the property from Marianne. The 3 were well known for their restaurant downtown. I am not sure what they planned on doing with the property, but on February 16th of 1982, they sell it to the Palm Beach Atlantic University, where it is then used for female dorms. Finally, we come to 1995, And there is quite a story about how the house finally makes it to Yesteryear Village. And here is where it will get its current name, the Riddle House. It was Carl Riddle's nephew that saves the house from being demolished and works hard to raise the funds for transportation and reconstruction, and it is placed in its current location. The story probably deserves a video of its own, but you can learn a lot just from looking at the pictures here. It was Carl Riddle's diary that tells us some of the hauntings that are associated with the house. It was my hope while doing all of this research to connect some of those legends to facts of who lived here. I have found some stories that could be connected to these passed down rumors, but nothing that involved those that primarily lived there. Of course, visitors come and go, and I am not saying that I have ruled out other possibilities. And in fact, my third segment of this series will focus on these legends and stories. The first segment was about the experiences of the new docent, James Danford, and this segment was a fact-finding mission to help others that might want to investigate on their own. If you have any information that you would like to share, please find my email down below in the description. I am Nikki, and this is NixPix. Click here to subscribe. YouTube thinks you'll like this video. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up. Make sure to leave a comment, and we'll see you real soon.